Divine Mercy in My Soul, Diary of St. Faustina. Published by Merriam Press, 2013.
Part 4, starting at section 93, where it says the vow of poverty. The vow of poverty is the voluntary renunciation of the right over property or the use of such property with the purpose of pleasing God. Question: what objects does the vow of poverty concern? Answer: all those goods and those objects which appertain to the community. We have no longer any right over anything that has been given to us. Once it has been accepted, whether an article or money, all these donations and presents, which may have been given to us out of gratitude or in any other way, belong by right to the community. We cannot make use without violating the vow of any wages we may receive for work or even anything else. Question: when do we break or violate the vow in a matter which entails the seventh commandment? Answer: we break or violate it when, without permission, we take for ourselves anything that belongs to the house, when, without permission, we retain something in order to appreciate it, and when, without authorization, we sell or exchange something that belongs to the community. When we make use of an object for some other purpose than that intended by the superior, when we give to or accept from another anything whatsoever without permission, when by negligence we destroy or damage something, when in going from one house to another we take something with us without permission. In a situation where the vow is broken, the religious is bound to restitution to the community. The virtue of poverty. This is an evangelical virtue which impels the heart to detach itself from temporal things. The religious, in virtue of his profession, is strictly obliged to it. Question: when do we sin against the virtue of poverty? Answer: when we desire something contrary to this virtue, when we become attached to something, and when we make use of superficial things. Question: how many degrees of poverty are there, and what are they? Answer: there are, in practice, 4 degrees of poverty. For one who is professed religious, to dispose of nothing without the consent of the superiors, the strict matter of the vow, to avoid superfluous and to be content with necessities, this pertains to the virtue. To readily content oneself with things of inferior quality in what concerns one's self, clothing, nourishment, etc., and to experience this contentment interiorly, to rejoice in extreme poverty. The vow of chastity. To what does this vow oblige us? Answer: to renounce marriage and to avoid everything that is forbidden by the 6th and 9th commandments. Question: is a fault against the virtue a violation of the vow? Answer: every fault against the virtue is the same time a violation of the vow, because here there is no difference, as in the case of poverty and obedience, between the vow and the virtue. Question: is every bad thought a sin? Answer: no, every bad thought is not a sin. It becomes so only when the act of the will and consent are joined to the consideration of the mind. Question: is there anything over and above sins against chastity which is detrimental to the virtue? Answer: lack of custody of the senses, of the imagination, of the feelings, familiarity, and sentimental friendships are detrimental to the virtue. Question: what are the means by which the virtue may be preserved? A. To conquer interior temptations with the thought of the presence of God, and moreover to fight without fear. And for exterior temptations to avoid occasions. They are, in all, 7 principal means: to guard the senses, to avoid occasions, to avoid idleness, to remove temptations promptly, to remove myself from all, and especially particular friendships, the spirit of mortification, and to reveal all the temptations to one's confessor. Besides this, there are also 5 means of preserving this virtue: humility, the spirit of prayer, modesty of the eyes, fidelity to the rule, and a sincere devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. The vow of obedience. The vow of obedience is superior to the first two. It is, to tell the truth, a holocaust, and is more necessary because it forms and animates the monastic body. Question. To what does the vow of obedience oblige us? Answer. By the vow of obedience, the religious promises to God to be obedient to his legitimate superiors in everything that they will ordain in virtue of the rule. The vow of obedience makes the religious dependent on his superior in virtue of these rules for his whole life and in all his affairs. A religious commits a grave sin against the vow every time he disobeys an order given in virtue of obedience and of these rules. The virtue of obedience. The virtue of obedience goes further than the vow. It embraces the rules, the regulations, and even the counsels of the superiors. Question. Is the virtue of obedience indispensable for a religious? Answer. The virtue of obedience is so indispensable to a religious that even if they were to perform good actions contrary to obedience, these would be evil and without merit. Question. Can we sin gravely against the virtue of obedience? Answer. We sin gravely when we scorn the authority or the order of the superior, or when spiritual or temporal harm to the community results from our disobedience. Question. What faults endanger the vow? Answer. To be prejudiced against the superior, or to harbor any antipathy for him, murmuring and criticism, tardiness and negligence. The degrees of obedience. Prompt and complete fulfillment. The obedience of the will when the will persuades the intellect to submit to the advice of the superior. To facilitate obedience. St. Ignatius suggests, moreover, 3 means. Always to see God in our superior, whoever he might be. To justify in itself the order or advice of the superior. To accept each order as an order from God, without examining it or reflecting on it. General means humility. Nothing is difficult for the humble. O my Lord, inflame my heart with love for you, that my spirit may not grow weary amidst the scorns and the sufferings and the trials. You see how weak I am. Love can do all. A deeper knowledge of God and the terror of the soul. In the beginning, God lets himself be known as holiness, justice, and goodness. That is to say, mercy. The soul does not come to know this all at once, but throughout time, in flashes, that is to say, when God draws near. And this does not last for long, because the soul could not bear such light. During prayer, the soul experiences flashes of this light, which make it possible to pray as before. Try as it might to force itself to pray as it did before, all this is in vain. It becomes completely impossible for it to continue to pray as it did not before it received this light. This light which has touched the soul is so alive within it, and nothing can either quench or diminish it. This flash of knowledge of God draws the soul and enkindles it with love for him. But the same flash at the same time allows the soul to know itself as it is. The soul sees a whole interior in a superior light, and it rises up alarmed and terrified. Still, it does not remain under the effects of terror, but it begins to purify itself, to humble and abase itself before the Lord. These lights become stronger and more frequent, and the more the soul is crystallized, the more these lights penetrate it. However, if the soul has responded faithfully and courageously to these first graces, God fills it with his consolation, gives himself in a perceptible manner. At certain moments the soul, as it were, enters into intimacy with God and greatly rejoices in this. It believes that it has already reached the degree of perfection destined for it, because it detects and faults are asleep within it, and this makes it think that they are no longer exist. Nothing seems difficult for it. It is ready for everything. It begins to plunge itself into God and taste the divine delights. It is carried along by grace and does not take account of the fact that the time of the trial and the testing may come, and in fact that this state does not last long. Other moments will soon come. I should add here, however, that the soul will respond more faithfully to divine grace if it has a well-informed confessor to whom it can confide everything. Trials sent by God to a soul which is particularly loved by him. Temptations and darkness. Satan. The soul's love for God is still not such as God would have it. The soul suddenly loses the tangible perception of God's presence. Various defects and imperfections rise up within it, and it must fight them furiously. All her faults lift up their heads. By the soul's vigilance is great. The former awareness of the presence of God gives place to coldness and spiritual dryness. The soul has no taste for spiritual exercise. It cannot pray, either in the old way or in the manner in which it had just begun to pray. It struggles this way and that, but can find no satisfaction. God has hidden himself from it, and it can find no consolation in creatures, nor can any of these creatures find a way of consoling it. The soul craves passionately for God, but sees its own misery. It begins to sense God's justice. It seems to do it that it has lost all of the gifts that God had given it, and its mind is dimmed, and the darkness fills it. Unspeakable torments begin. The soul tries to explain its state to the confessor, but it is not understood, and it is assailed by even greater unrest, and Satan begins his work. Faith staggers under the impact. The struggle is fierce. The soul tries hard to cling to God by an act of the will. With God's permission, Satan goes even further. Hope and love are put to the test. These temptations are terrible. God supports the soul in secret, so to speak. The soul is not aware of this, but otherwise it would be impossible to stand firm. And God knows very well how much he can allow to befall a soul. The soul is tempted to unbelief in respect to reveal the truth, and so in sincerity toward the confessor. Satan says to it, "Look, no one understands you. Why speak about all this?" Words that terrify it sound in its ears, and it seems to be that the soul is uttering this against God. It sees what it does not want to see. It hears what it does not want to hear. And oh, how terrible a thing at times like these not to have an experienced confessor. The soul carries the whole burden alone. However, one should make every effort to find it, if it is at all possible, a well-informed confessor. For the soul can collapse under the burden and come to the very edge of the precipice. All these trials are heavy and difficult. God does not send them to a soul which has not already been admitted to a deeper intimacy with him and which has not yet tasted the divine delights. Besides, in this, God has his own plans, which for us are impenetrable. God often prepares a soul in this way for his future designs and great works. He wants to try it as pure as gold is tried, but this is not yet the end of the testing. There is still the trial of trials, the complete abandonment of the soul by God. The trial of trials, complete abandonment, despair. When the soul comes out victorious from the preceding trials, even though it may stumble here and there, it fights on valiantly, humbly calling upon God, "Save me, I am perishing," and it is still able to fight on. At this point, however, the soul is engulfed in a horrible night. It sees within itself only sin. It feels terrible. It sees itself completely abandoned by God. It feels itself to be an object of his hatred. It is but one step away from despair. The soul does its best to defend itself. It tries to stir up confidence, but prayer is an even greater torment for it. As this prayer seems to arouse God to an even greater anger, the soul finds itself poised on the summit of a lofty mountain on the very brink of the precipice. The soul is drawn to God, but feels repulsed. All other sufferings and tortures in the world are nothing compared with this sensation into which has been plunged, namely that of being rejected by God. No one can bring it any relief. It finds itself completely alone. There is no one to defend it. It raises its eyes to heaven, but is convinced that this is not for her. For her, all is loss. It falls deeper and deeper from darkness to darkness, and it seems to it that it has lost forever the God it used to love so dearly. This thought is a torture beyond all description, but the soul does not agree to it and tries to lift its gaze towards heaven, but in vain, and this makes the torture even more intense. If God wishes to keep the soul in such darkness, no one will be able to give it light. It experiences rejection by God in a vivid and terrifying manner. From its heart burst forth painful moans, so painful that no priest will comprehend it, unless he himself has been through these trials. In the midst of this, the evil spirit adds to the soul's suffering, mocking it. Will you persist in your faithfulness? This is your reward. You are in our power. But Satan has only as much influence over the soul as God allows him. And God knows how much we can bear. What have you gotten out of these mortifications, says Satan, and out of your fidelity to the rule? What use are all of these efforts? You have been rejected by God. This word, rejected, becomes a fire which penetrates every nerve to the marrow of the bone. It pierces right through her entire being. The ordeal reaches its climax. The soul is no longer looks for help anywhere. It shrinks into itself and loses sight of everything. It is as though it has accepted the torture of being abandoned. This is a moment for which I have no words. This is the agony of the soul. When for the first time this moment was drawing near, I was snatched from it by the virtue of holy obedience. The directress of novices, alarmed by my appearance, sent me off to confession, but the confessor did not understand me, and I experienced no relief whatsoever. O Jesus, give us experienced priests. When I told this priest I was undergoing an infernal tortures, he answered that he was not worried about my soul because he saw in it great grace of God. But I understood nothing of this, and not even the least glimmer of the light broke through into my soul. Then my physical strength began to fail me, and I could no longer carry out my duties, nor could I any longer hide my sufferings. Although I did not say a word about them, the look of pain on my face betrayed me. The superior told me that the sisters had come to her, saying that, when they look at me in the chapel, they are moved to pity because I look so terrible. Yet despite all efforts, the soul is unable to conceal such suffering. Jesus, you alone know how the soul, engulfed in darkness, moans in the midst of these torments, and despite all of this, thirsts for God as burning lips thirst for water. It dies and withers. It dies a death without death. That is to say, it cannot die. All its efforts come to nothing. It is under a powerful hand. Now the soul comes under the power of the Just One. All exterior temptations cease. Although surrounds, it becomes silent, like a dying person who loses contact with everything around it. The person's entire soul is in the hand of the just God, the thrice holy God, rejected for all eternity. This is culminating moment, and God alone can test a soul in this way, because he alone knows what the soul can endure. When the soul has been saturated through and through by this infernal fire, it is, as it were, cast headlong into great despair. My soul experienced this moment when I was all alone in my cell, when my soul began to sink into this despair. I felt that the end was near, but I seized my little crucifix and clutched it tightly in my hand. And now I felt my body separate itself from my soul. And though I wanted to go to my superiors, I no longer had the physical strength. I uttered my last words, I trust in your mercy. And it seemed to me that I provoked God to an even greater anger. And now I was drowned in despair. And all that was left in me was a moan of the unadulterated pain, which from time to time tore itself from my soul. The soul is in agony. And it seemed to me that I would remain in this state because of my own strength. I could not emerge from it. Every recollection of God opened up as an unspeakable ocean of suffering. And yet despite this, there is something within the soul which is drawn to him, though it seems to her for this only, that she may suffer more. The memory of the love with which God formerly surrounded it is still another kind of suffering. His gaze pierces it, and everything within the soul is burned by this gaze. After some time, one of the sisters came into the cell and found me almost dead. She was frightened and went to find the directress of novices, who in the name of holy obedience ordered me to get up from the ground. My strength returned immediately, and I got up. Trembling, the directress recognized immediately the state of my soul and spoke to me about the inscrutable mercy of God, saying, "Do not be distressed about anything, sister. I command this of you in virtue of obedience." Then she said to me, "I see now, sister, that God is calling you to a high degree of holiness. The Lord wants to draw you very close to himself, since he has allowed these things to happen to you so soon. Be faithful to God, sister, because this is a sign that he wants you to have a high place in heaven." However, I did not understand any of these words. When I went into the chapel, I felt as though my soul had been set free from everything, as though I had just come forth from the hand of God. I perceived that of my soul. I felt like I was a tiny child. Suddenly I saw the Lord interiorly, and he said to me, "Fear not, my daughter, I am with you." In a single moment all the darkness and torments vanished. My senses were inundated with the unspeakable joy, and the faculties of my soul filled with light. I want to add that although my soul was already in the rays of his love, traces of my past tortures remained on my body for 2 days, a deathly pale face and bloodshot eyes. Jesus alone knows what I suffered. What I have written is very poor compared to the reality. I cannot put it into words. It seemed to me that I had come back from another world. I feel an aversion for everything that is created. I snuggle to the heart of God like a baby to its mother's breast. I see everything differently now. I am conscious of what the Lord, by one single word, has done in my soul, and I live by it. I shudder at the recollection of this past torture. I would not have believed that one could suffer so if I had not gone through it myself. This is completely spiritual suffering. However, in all these sufferings and struggles, I was not omitting Holy Communion. When it seemed to me that I should not communicate, I went before Holy Communion to the directress and told her that I could not approach the sacrament, because it seemed to me that I should not do so. But she would not permit me to omit Holy Communion. So I went, and I understood now that it was only by obedience that saved me. The directress herself told me later that my trials had passed quickly, and this solely because you were obedient, sister, and it was through the power of obedience that you struggled through this so bravely. It is true that it was the Lord himself who brought me out of this torment by my fidelity to obedience did please him. Though these are frightening things, the soul should not be too fearful, because God will never test us beyond what we are able to bear. On the other hand, he may never send such sufferings, but I write this because it pleases the Lord to let a soul pass through such sufferings. It should not be afraid, but insofar as this depends on the soul itself, it should remain faithful to God. God will do a soul no harm because he is love itself, and in this unfathomable love has called it into being. However, when I was tormented, I myself did not understand this. Oh my God, I have come to know that I am not of this earth. You, O Lord, have poured this profound awareness into my soul. My communion is more with heaven than with earth, though in no way neglect my duties. During those times, I had no spiritual director. I was without my kind of guidance whatsoever. I begged the Lord, but he did not give me a director. Jesus himself has been my master from the days of my infancy up to the present moment. He accompanied me across all the deserts and through all the dangers. I see clearly that God alone could have led me through such terrible perils unharmed. With my soul untarnished and passing victoriously through all difficulties, immense though they were, going out. Later on, the Lord did give me a director. After such sufferings, the soul finds itself in a state of great purity of spirit and very close to God. But I should add that during these spiritual torments, it is close to God, but it is blind. The soul's vision is plundered into darkness, and though God is nearer than ever to the soul with its suffering, the whole secret consists in the fact that it knows nothing of this. The soul, in fact, declares that not only has God abandoned it, but it is the object of his hatred. How grave it is The malady of the eyes of the soul which struck by divine light claims that there is no light, whereas it is so intense that it blinds her. Yet despite of it all, I learned later that God is closer to a soul at such moments than others, because it would not be able to endure these trials with the help of ordinary grace alone. God's greatness and extraordinary grace must be active here, for otherwise the soul would succumb to the first blow. O divine Master, what happens in my soul is your work alone. You, O Lord, are not afraid to place the soul on the edge of terrible precepts where it stands, alarmed and filled with fright, and then you call it back again to yourself. These are your imponderable mysteries. When in the midst of these interior torments, I tried to accuse myself in confession of the smallest trifles, the priest was surprised that I had not committed graver faults, and he said to me, "If you are as faithful as this to God during these sufferings, this in itself is evidence to me that God is sustaining you, sister, with a special grace, and it is a good thing that you do not understand this. It is a strange thing, nevertheless, that confessors could neither understand me nor set my mind at peace concerning these matters, until I met Father Andras, and later on, Father Sabuco." A few words about confession and confessors. I shall speak only of what I have experienced and gone through within my own soul. There are 3 things which hinder the soul from drawing profit from confession in these exceptional moments. The first thing, when the confessor has little knowledge of extraordinary graces, or extraordinary ways, and shows surprise if the soul discloses to him the great mysteries worked in it by God. Such a surprise frightens a sensitive soul, and it notices that the confessor hesitates to give his opinion. And if it does this, it will not be set at peace, but will have even more doubts about confession than before, because it will sense that the confessor is trying to set it at peace while he himself is uncertain. Or else, as he happened to be me, a confessor unable to penetrate some of the soul's mysteries, refuses to hear the confession, showing a certain fear when the soul approaches the confessional. How can a soul in this state obtain peace in the confessional when it has become so oversensitive to every word of the priest? In my opinion, at the times of such special trials sent by God to a soul, the priest, if he does not understand the soul, should direct it to some other experienced and well-instructed confessor. Or he himself should seek light in order to give the soul what it needs, instead of downrightly denying it confession. For in this way he is exposing the soul to a great danger, and the more than one soul may well leave the road along which God wanted it to journey. This is a matter of a great importance, for I have experienced it myself. I myself began to waver, despite special gifts from God, and even though God himself reassured me, I have nevertheless always wanted to have the church's seal as well. The second thing, the confessor does not allow the soul to express itself frankly and shows impatience. The soul then falls silent and does not say everything it has to say, and by this profits nothing. It profits even less when the confessor, without really knowing the soul, proceeds to put it to the test. Instead of helping the soul, he does it harm. The soul is aware that the confessor does not know it, because he did not allow it to lay itself open fully as regards both its graces and its misery. And so the test is ill-adapted. I have been submitted to some test as which I have had to laugh. I will express this better thus. The confessor is the doctor of the soul, but how can a doctor prescribe suitable remedy if he does not know the nature of the sickness? Never will he be able to do so, for either the remedy will not produce the desired effect, or else it will be too strong and will just make the illness more, and sometimes, God forbid, even bring about death. I am speaking from my own experience because, in certain instances, it was the Lord himself who directly sustained me. The third thing, it has also happened sometimes that the confessor makes light of little things. There is nothing little in the spiritual life. Sometimes a seemingly insignificant thing will disclose a matter of great consequence, and will be for the confessor as a beam of light, which helps him to get to know the soul. Many spiritual undertones are concealed in little things. A magnificent building will never rise if we reject the insignificant bricks. God demands great purity of certain souls, and so he gives them a deeper knowledge of their own misery. Illuminated by light from on high, the soul can better know what pleases God and what does not. Sin depends upon the degree of knowledge and light that exists within the soul. The same is true of imperfections. Although the soul knows that it is only sin in the strict sense of the term which pertains to the sacrament of penance, yet these petty things of great importance to a soul which is tending to its sanctity, and the confessor must not treat them lightly. The patience and kindness of a confessor open the way to the innermost secrets of the soul. The soul unconsciously, as it were, reveals it to the depths and feels stronger and more resistant. It fights with greater courage and tries to do things better because it knows it must give an account of them. I will mention one more thing regarding the confessor. It is his duty to occasionally put to the test, to try, to exercise, to learn whether he is dealing with straw, with iron, or with pure gold. Each of these three types of souls need different kinds of training. The confessor must, and this is absolutely necessary from a clear judgment of each soul in order to know how a heavy burden it can carry at certain times, in certain circumstances, or in particular situations. As for myself, it was only later on, after many negative experiences, that when I saw that I was not understood, I no longer laid bare my soul or allowed my peace to be disturbed. But this happened only when all these graces had already been submitted to the judgment of the wise, well-instructed, and experienced confessors. Now I know what to go by in certain cases.
Eternal Father, I offer you the body and blood, soul and divinity, the dearly beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, in atonement for our sins and those of the whole world.
Jesus, I trust in you. Saint Faustina, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.